By the next morning in 1905, somewhere in Arkansas, the iron truss bridge stood empty. The lantern May Whitcomb had carried the night before sat upright on the crossbeam, glass clean, oil half gone, wick trimmed neat. But May and Thomas were not on the bridge anymore, and the grating under the trusses showed no mark where two people had walked halfway and stopped. The bridge crossed the White River just south of a bend where the current slowed and the ferries used to run all hours. It was narrow, one wagon wide, iron girders rising in a lattice overhead, open grating for a deck so you could see the water moving 20 feet below. The state put it up in 1903 to replace the ferry crossing, but most folks still preferred the boats. The bridge felt too open, too much like walking on air with nothing but rivets and rust holding you up. On summer evenings, the air off the river was thick and cool, and by September the fog would roll in before dusk and sit heavy until the sun burned it off past dawn. The sound the bridge made when you walked across it, that hollow clang of boots on iron grating, the creak of rivets shifting under weight, it didn't sit right with people who'd grown up trusting wood and rope and the steady pull of a ferry. May Whitcomb was 19. Thomas was 22. They married on a Saturday afternoon in the small Baptist church 3 miles inland, with 30 people gathered and a table of food laid out under the trees afterward. May wore a dress her mother had sewn over 2 months, pale gray cotton with lace at the collar. Thomas wore a borrowed coat and new boots that hadn't broken in yet, and by the end of the afternoon his feet were sore, but he didn't complain. May's father was a tenant farmer who worked land near the church, and Thomas had been hired on at the lumber mill 2 miles upriver. They were quiet people, the kind who worked steady and didn't ask for much. May had a habit of tucking her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, and Thomas had a way of standing with his weight on one leg, hat in hand, like he was always about to leave, but never quite did. They ate quietly at the wedding, smiled when people spoke to them, and left before sunset with a lantern, a canvas satchel, and a leather-bound Bible May's father had given them that morning. The Bible was small, black leather with a red ribbon sewn into the binding, and inside the front cover May's father had written their names in ink. May and Thomas Whitcomb, September 16th, 1905. He'd used his good pen, the one he kept in a tin box on the mantel, and the letters were careful and straight. May held the Bible against her chest when they said their goodbyes, and her mother kissed her on the forehead and told her to be safe crossing the bridge. Thomas had rented a room above the dry goods store on the far side of the river. It was modest. 1 bed, 1 chair, a stove in the corner, a window that looked out over the dirt road leading into town, but it was theirs, and they planned to walk across the bridge that evening and start their first night as husband and wife in a place that belonged to no one else. The bridge was a 20-minute walk if you took your time, less if you hurried. The ferry dock sat a 1/4 mile downstream, and the last boat usually left around 6. Most people still took the ferry if they crossed after dark, even though the bridge was faster. There was something about the way the fog sat on the iron, something about the sound your boots made on that grating, that made you want solid planks and a boatman who'd done the crossing 1,000 times before. They started across just after 5:30, when the light was still good, and the fog hadn't rolled in yet. A handful of people saw them step onto the bridge. 2 boys fishing off the bank with cane poles and a tin bucket between them, a man loading firewood onto a flatbed near the approach, a woman hanging laundry on a line behind the general store. All of them said the same thing later. May was carrying the lantern even though it was still light, holding it low in her right hand, and Thomas had the satchel slung over one shoulder. They walked slowly, like people do when there's no need to hurry, and about 1/3 of the way across, Thomas stopped and pointed down at the water. May leaned over the rail to look, and they stood there for a moment, just the 2 of them, watching the current move beneath the grating. Then they kept walking. Halfway across, where the trusses rose highest and the grating let you see straight down to the river, the lantern swung once. The woman hanging laundry saw it, a single arc of light, deliberate, like May had lifted it to see something better. Then it kept moving forward, smooth and steady, as if someone were still carrying it. But no footsteps sounded on the iron grating. No voices, no sound at all except the river sliding past below and the creak of metal settling in the cooling air. The boys fishing didn't notice anything wrong. The man with the firewood had already turned back to his work. But the woman kept watching, and she said later that the light moved all the way to the center of the bridge and then stopped. And for a long moment, it just sat there, hanging in the air, before it went dark. By 6 o'clock, when Thomas's cousin arrived at the rented room to drop off a chair they'd promised, the door was still locked and no one answered. The cousin knocked twice, waited, knocked again. He could hear the wind moving through the window gap, but nothing else. He waited 10 minutes, checking his pocket watch twice, then walked back across the bridge to ask if anyone had seen them. The woman hanging laundry said they'd crossed an hour ago and hadn't come back. The man with the firewood said the same. The two boys had gone home for supper, but their father confirmed they'd seen a couple walking across just before dark. That's when someone went out onto the bridge with a second lantern and found Mays sitting there on a crossbeam halfway across, perfectly upright, glass unbroken, still a little warm to the touch. The wedding Bible lay on the girder beside it. The leather was dry and warm, warmer than it should have been, and when they opened it, the red ribbon was still pressed flat between the pages where May had marked the Psalms that morning. The ink in the inscription hadn't smudged, but the girder itself was slick with dew, cold enough to make your hand ache if you touched it too long, and the condensation had pooled in the rivet holes all along the beam. The Bible sat in a space where no moisture had formed, a clean oval maybe 8 inches long, bone dry, like something had been holding it warm and keeping the dew away until just a moment before. 10 feet farther along the span, pressed into a thin layer of rust dust on the grating, were 2 rings. May's and Thomas's. They rested side by side in a circle no bigger than a coffee cup, and inside that circle the metal was dry. Outside it, dew covered everything. The condensation stopped at the edge like it was obeying a line someone had drawn. One of the men crouched down and touched the dry spot with his finger, then pulled his hand back fast. The metal there wasn't just dry, it was warm. Sheriff Ephraim Deal arrived just past 7 with a lantern of his own and a coil of rope. He was a heavy man, slow to move, careful with his words, and he didn't like the bridge even in daylight. He'd been sheriff for 6 years and had dealt with drownings, accidents, fights that ended badly, but nothing like this. He roped off the section where the Bible and rings had been found, then walked the full span twice, looking at every rivet, every join, every place where someone might have climbed down or been pulled through. The grating was too tight for a body to slip through. The gaps were maybe 2 inches wide, enough to see the river, but not enough for anything larger than a hat to fall through. The girders overhead were open to the sky. No roof, no cover, just iron lattice rising 15 feet above the deck. There was no place to hide, no ladder, no rope, no sign that anyone had rigged anything to pull someone off the bridge. He checked the approach on both sides, walked down to the riverbank below with 2 men carrying lanterns, and sent them out in a boat to drift the current and look for anything caught on the pilings. They found nothing, not a scrap of cloth, not a boot print in the mud, not a single sign that May and Thomas Whitcomb had stepped off the bridge or fallen from it. The water was slow there, clear enough to see bottom in daylight, and the pilings were clean. Then one of the men noticed the tracks. They started at the center span, right where the Bible had been, and they walked backward toward the south end of the bridge, heel first, toe dragging, like someone walking in reverse or something pulling a man's boots across the grating without the man inside them. The prints were clear for about 15 feet, then they faded and stopped where the rust dust thinned out over cleaner metal. Deal crouched down and looked at them with his lantern held low. The prints were deep enough to be real, shallow enough that whoever made them wasn't carrying much weight. And they were Thomas's boots. He recognized the tread from the new pair Thomas had worn at the wedding. Deal roped the trusses and marked the prints with chalk. He sent word to the state marshal and to the ferry operator, and by 8 o'clock there were 20 people gathered on both sides of the river, some with lanterns, some just standing in the dark and staring at the bridge like it might give up an answer if they looked long enough. The air off the water was cold now, and the fog was starting to roll in, thick and low, creeping up the banks and curling around the iron supports. The ferry operator, a man named Pruitt who'd worked the river for 30 years, came up to the bridge and stood at the south approach for a long time without saying anything. His father had run the ferry before him, and his grandfather before that. He was the kind of man who knew the river in his bones, where the current pulled hardest, where the sandbars shifted, where you didn't tie up at night. Finally, he turned to Deal and said, "I told the state this bridge was wrong. Ferry's been running this water since before the war and we never lost a soul. Now you put up iron where iron doesn't belong and this is what you get." Deal asked him what he meant by that. Pruitt shook his head and looked out at the bridge, half hidden now in fog. "There's a reason we don't run at night anymore," he said. "There's a reason the old-timers wouldn't cross after dusk, even when the ferry was free. You ask them. They'll tell you the river takes what it wants and you don't argue with it. You just stay off the water when the light's gone. Men in Arkansas still won't walk that bridge alone after dark. Some of them remember why. Most of them just know it's a rule you don't break, the way you don't swim in a flooded river or camp in a dry wash during storm season. It's not written down anywhere, and nobody talks about it unless you ask directly. But if you do ask, the older ones will tell you what they found that night in 1905, and they'll tell you what came after. And by the time they're done, you'll understand why the bridge sits empty between dusk and dawn, and why people in Arkansas still cross by ferry when the sun starts to fall." By dawn the next morning, Sheriff Deal had walked the bridge 4 more times and still found nothing that made sense. He'd sent men down river as far as the old mill dam, checked every sandbar and snag where a body might catch, and questioned everyone who'd been near the crossing between 5 and 7 the evening before. The story they gave him was simple, but the details didn't line up the way details should. The woman hanging laundry, her name was Iris Callum, and she lived behind the general store, said she'd watched May and Thomas step onto the bridge at 5:32. She knew the time because she'd checked the store clock before going out to hang the wash, and the light was still good. She said they walked slowly, stopped once about a third of the way across, then kept going. She saw the lantern swing once, high and deliberate right at the center span. Then it kept moving, smooth as if May were still carrying it. But Iris swore she didn't see their shapes anymore, just the light. She watched it reach the middle of the bridge and go dark. She thought maybe they'd set it down to look at something, or maybe the oil had run low. She finished hanging the wash and went inside. She didn't think anything was wrong until Thomas's cousin came asking after them an hour later. The man loading firewood, his name was Harlan Voss, said he saw them start across but he'd turned back to his work before they reached the halfway point. He heard boots on the grating for a while, then he didn't. He didn't think much of it. People crossed all the time, and the sound carried different depending on the wind. He loaded 3 more cords onto his flatbed, and by the time he finished it was almost 6:30. He didn't see them come back. The 2 boys fishing, both around 12 years old, said May and Thomas passed them on the approach just after 5:30. One of the boys, the younger one named Samuel, said Thomas had smiled at them and nodded, and May had tucked her hair behind her ear the way women do when they're shy or thinking about something else. They watched the couple walk maybe a quarter of the way out, then went back to watching their lines. Neither of them heard anything strange. No shout, no splash, no sound of boots stopping suddenly. They packed up their gear around 6 and went home for supper. Deal wrote it all down in his notebook, then went back over the times. If May and Thomas had stepped onto the bridge at 5:32 and walked at a normal pace, they should have reached the far side by 5:45, maybe 5:50 at the latest. The bridge was 300 feet long, but Thomas's cousin had knocked on the rented room door at 6 o'clock and found it locked, and no one on the far side of the river had seen them come off the bridge. Iris Callum said the lantern went dark around 5:40. That meant May and Thomas had been on the bridge for 8 minutes, maybe 10, and then they weren't anywhere at all. Deal stood at the south end of the bridge just after sunrise and looked at the Bible and the rings, still sitting where they'd been found. He'd covered them with a canvas tarp overnight to keep the dew off, but when he pulled the tarp back, the Bible was warm again. Not hot, not like it had been sitting in the sun, but warm the way a book gets when you've been holding it in your lap for a while. The rings were the same. He touched one with the tip of his finger and pulled back. It wasn't painful, but it wasn't right either. He called for a search party. By 8 o'clock there were 30 men gathered on both sides of the river, some from the mill, some from the farms inland, some who'd just heard and come to help. They split into groups, one to walk the riverbank north and south, one to take boats and drag hooks through the shallows, one to search the woods on the west side where the road led away from the bridge. Deal organized them in pairs and told them to tie strips of cloth to trees and fence posts as they went, so they'd know which ground had already been covered. He sent 2 men to check the ferry dock downstream, just in case May and Thomas had somehow walked off the far end of the bridge and doubled back along the bank. The search went slow. The woods along the river were thick with oak and sweet gum, and the undergrowth was dense enough that you couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead in places. The men called out as they went, "May, Thomas," and listened for an answer that never came. By midday, they'd covered a half-mile in every direction and found nothing. No torn cloth, no boot prints in the soft ground near the water, no sign that anyone had left the bridge by any route except straight down into the river. But the river had been dragged twice by then, and the hooks came up clean every time. That's when the first strange thing happened. One of the men searching the west bank, a mill worker named Calhoun, called out that he'd found something. Deal and 3 others went crashing through the brush to where Calhoun stood, and he pointed at the ground near a rotted stump. There, pressed into the soft mud, was a single boot print. A woman's boot, small, narrow, with a worn heel. It matched the kind of shoes May had been wearing, but the print was facing away from the river, toward the road, and there was only one. No second print beside it, no trail leading to it or away from it, just one clear print in mud soft enough to hold the shape of every stitch in the sole, sitting in the middle of a patch of ground that showed no other sign of disturbance. Calhoun crouched down and touched the edge of the print. The mud was still damp, fresh enough that it couldn't have been more than a day old. He looked up at Deal and said, "Sheriff, this ground was clear yesterday. I walked this same stretch looking for firewood, and there wasn't any print here then." Deal marked the spot with a strip of cloth tied to a low branch, and they kept searching. An hour later, another man found a second print, this one Thomas's boot, deep and clear, pressed into the dirt on the east bank about 200 yards downstream from the bridge. Same problem. One print, no trail, no sign of how it got there. The ground around it was dry and hard-packed, the kind of dirt that doesn't take a print unless you step with all your weight behind it. But there it was, perfect and fresh, like someone had walked out of the air, stepped once, and vanished again. By mid-afternoon, the search parties had covered nearly 2 miles of riverbank and found 6 prints in total, all of them isolated, all of them facing strange directions. 1 heel first, 2 pointed back toward the bridge, 1 pressed so deep it looked like someone had been standing in that spot for a long time. None of them connected. None of them made sense. The men started talking quietly among themselves. A few of them, the older ones, the ones who'd grown up near the river, began to pull back from the search. One of them, a man named Vigil who'd worked the ferry with Pruitt's father years before, told Deal flat out he wasn't going any farther into the woods. "There's places you don't go looking," he said. "There's places that don't want to be found." Deal asked him what he meant. Vigil shook his head. "My father told me when I was young, you don't cross that river after dark unless you're on a boat with a boatman who knows the water. The bridge don't change that. It just made it easier for people to forget." Around 4 o'clock, one of the men dragging the river with a grappling hook called out. Deal went down to the bank and waded out to the boat. The man held up the hook, and tangled in the prongs was a piece of cloth, pale gray cotton, torn clean along one edge, about 6 inches square. It was wet, but when Deal took it in his hands it was still warm. Not river cold the way cloth should be after sitting in the water, but warm, like it had just come off someone's body. He turned it over and saw the lace edging. It matched May's wedding dress. He wrapped the cloth in a dry handkerchief and put it in his coat pocket. It stayed warm all the way back to shore. That evening, just before sunset, Deal organized a second sweep of the bridge itself. He wanted every rivet checked, every joint examined, every inch of grating inspected to make sure there was no hatch or hidden gap someone could have slipped through. 6 men went out with lanterns and ropes working in pairs, while Deal stood at the center span and directed them. They found nothing. The bridge was solid. No loose boards, no trick panels, no hidden spaces. Just iron and air and the sound of the river moving below. Then, just as the light started to fail and the fog began rolling in again, one of the men called out. He was standing near the north end of the bridge, at the exact spot where the backward boot prints had stopped the night before. He pointed down at the grating. There, laid neat and flat on the iron, was a second Bible. Same size, same black leather, same red ribbon. Deal walked over and crouched down beside it. The man with the lantern leaned in close, and they both stared. The Bible was dry. The grating under it was slick with fresh dew, but the book itself was bone dry. And when Deal opened it, he saw the same inscription inside. May and Thomas Whitcomb, September 16th, 1905. The handwriting was identical. The ink was the same. But this Bible had been sitting at Deal's office all day, locked in a drawer with the rings and the scrap of cloth. He'd checked it himself before coming out to the bridge. One of the other men, a young mill hand who'd only been in Arkansas a year, said, "How'd it get out here?" Nobody answered. Deal stood up slowly and looked back toward the south end of the bridge, where the first Bible had been found. The distance between the two spots was maybe 100 feet. He could see the chalk marks he'd made on the grating, still visible in the fading light. He turned to the man beside him and said, "Go back to the office. Check the drawer. Tell me if the first Bible is still there." The man ran. The rest of them waited. The fog thickened, curling up through the grating in slow ribbons, and the sound of the river seemed louder now, more deliberate. 10 minutes later, the man came back, breathing hard, and said the drawer was still locked. The first Bible was still inside. The older hands in Arkansas told the younger ones that night, "You don't check the bridge alone anymore. You don't cross it after the sun starts to fall. And if you see a light moving out there in the fog, you don't go looking to see who's carrying it." Deal stood on the bridge until full dark, staring down at the second Bible, trying to make the pieces fit. But they didn't fit. They never would. And by the time he finally walked back to shore, the fog had settled so thick over the iron span that you couldn't see the far side at all. Just the faint glow of lanterns hung on both approaches, and the hollow sound of water moving through the dark below. By the third day, the search had turned into something else. Not a rescue anymore, but a vigil. The families came out in shifts, bringing food and coffee, sitting in groups on both sides of the river while the men continued to walk the same ground they'd already walked twice before. May's mother stayed near the south approach, wrapped in a shawl even though the afternoon sun was warm and she didn't speak to anyone. Thomas's father, a quiet man who worked at the sawmill upriver, joined the search parties each morning and walked until his boots wore blisters, but he never said a word about what he thought had happened. People didn't ask. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like guessing, and guessing felt wrong when two people were gone, and the only things left behind were objects that shouldn't have been where they were. Sheriff Deal organized the search into a grid. He brought in a surveyor from the county seat and had him draw a map of the area within a mile of the bridge. Every path, every clearing, every bend in the river. Then he divided it into sections and assigned teams to walk each one in a line, shoulder to shoulder, calling out and marking trees as they went. They checked the woods, the fields, the abandoned homestead a half-mile west where squatters sometimes camped. They dragged the river again, this time with weighted nets, and came up with nothing but silt and broken branches. They checked the ferry dock, the mill road, the cut-through trail that led to the church where May and Thomas had been married 3 days before. On the fourth day, they found a third Bible. It was sitting on the steps of the church right in front of the door, laid flat on the top step where anyone coming for morning service would have to step over it. The pastor found it just after dawn when he came to unlock the building. He picked it up, opened it, and saw the inscription. Then he walked straight to the sheriff's office, still carrying the Bible in both hands like it might burn him if he held it wrong. Deal took the Bible and set it on his desk next to the first one, which he'd brought back from the locked drawer the night before. The second Bible, the one found on the bridge at dusk, was still out there, sitting on a beam where he'd left it under a tarp. He opened the third Bible and compared the handwriting. Identical. Same ink, same hand, same careful lettering. He checked the ribbon. Same red thread, same fraying at the edge where it had been sewn into the binding. He held both Bibles up to the light from the window and looked at the grain of the leather. Same pattern. Same wear along the spine. The pastor, a man named Reverend Gaines, who'd performed the wedding ceremony, stood in the doorway and said, "That's May's father's handwriting. I watched him write it Saturday morning before the service. He used the pen his own father gave him, and he took his time with every letter. There was only one Bible, Sheriff. I handed it to May myself after the ceremony." Deal asked if anyone else had been near the church that morning. Gaines shook his head. "I walked over from the parsonage just after sunrise, same as always. The church was locked. The steps were clean. I'd swept them myself Saturday afternoon after the wedding. That Bible wasn't there when I locked up Saturday night, and it wasn't there when I walked past at sunset yesterday. It was there this morning." Deal wrapped all 3 Bibles in cloth and locked them in the office safe. Then he went back to the bridge. The search parties were smaller now. Some of the men had gone back to work. They had families to feed, crops to tend, mill shifts to cover. But a core group of maybe 15 stayed on, walking the grid one more time. Deal joined them, and they worked through the morning in silence, eyes on the ground, boots crunching through dry leaves and over hard-packed dirt. Around midday, one of the men called out from a clearing about 300 yards west of the bridge. Deal walked over and found him standing next to a fence post at the edge of an old pasture. A strip of cloth was tied to the post, one of the markers they'd used on the first day to show which areas had been searched. But below it, carved into the wood with something sharp, were 2 words: "Check downstream." The carving was fresh. The wood inside the cuts was pale and clean, and there was sawdust still caught in the grooves. Deal ran his finger over the letters and felt the edges. They were rough, done in a hurry, but the handwriting was clear. One of the men leaned in and said, "That's Thomas's hand. I seen him mark lumber at the mill 100 times. He writes his T's with a hook at the top just like that." Deal asked when the post had last been checked. The man said they'd walked past it the day before, mid-afternoon, and there'd been no carving then, just the cloth strip and the old fence wire stapled to the wood. They went downstream. Another half-mile past the mill dam to a stretch of the river where the current slowed and pooled in a wide bend. The water there was deeper, darker, and the banks were soft mud that sucked at your boots when you tried to walk close to the edge. They searched the banks, waded into the shallows with poles to test the depth, and found nothing. But on the way back, one of the men noticed something caught in the roots of a willow tree that leaned out over the water. He pulled it free and held it up. It was a satchel. Canvas, worn at the corners, with a leather strap. The same satchel Thomas had been carrying when he and May stepped onto the bridge. The satchel was dry, completely dry, inside and out, even though it had been tangled in roots 6 inches above the waterline where the river spray and morning dew should have soaked it through. Deal opened it and found Thomas's coat folded neat inside, along with a half loaf of bread wrapped in paper, a tin cup, and a small leather pouch with $3 in coins. Everything clean, everything dry, everything arranged like someone had packed it carefully and set it down to be found. At the bottom of the satchel, tucked inside the folded coat, was a piece of paper. Deal pulled it out and unfolded it. The paper was clean, unwrinkled, and written across it in pencil were 4 words: "We are still here." The handwriting was May's. Reverend Gaines confirmed it later that evening when Deal brought the note to the parsonage. He said May had written out the guest list for the wedding reception, and the letters matched exactly. The way she looped her W's, the way she crossed her H's with a slight upward tilt. But May had been gone for 4 days, and the note looked like it had been written that morning. People started talking then, the way people do when the facts stop making sense and the only thing left is to fill the silence with guesses. Some said Thomas and May had run off together, staged the whole thing, and the note was their way of laughing at everyone who'd wasted time looking for them. But that didn't explain the Bibles, or the boot prints that led nowhere, or the way the satchel stayed dry in a place where nothing stayed dry. Others said there'd been an accident. Maybe they'd fallen from the bridge somehow, hit their heads, wandered off confused, and someone had found them and taken them in. But no one within 20 miles had seen them, and the note didn't sound confused. It sounded calm, deliberate. A few people, mostly the older ones who remembered stories from before the bridge was built, said the river had taken them. They didn't say it loud, and they didn't say it when Sheriff Deal was around, but they said it to each other in low voices when the search parties broke for meals or when they gathered on the porches at night. "The river takes what it wants," one woman said. "It don't matter if you build a bridge over it or not. It still wants what it wants." Another man, one of the ferry workers who'd helped Pruitt's father years before, said he'd heard stories about people who crossed the river at the wrong time. Not on the ferry, not with someone who knew the water, but on their own, trusting iron and stone instead of wood and rope. He said those people didn't always make it across, and when they didn't, the river kept them. Not their bodies, just them. And sometimes, if you listened close on a foggy night, you could hear them calling from the water asking to be let go. Deal didn't put any stock in that kind of talk, but he couldn't ignore the facts either. 3 Bibles that shouldn't exist. A note written in May's hand days after she vanished. A satchel that stayed dry in a place where dry things don't stay. Boot prints scattered across 2 miles of riverbank, each one isolated, each one facing a direction that made no sense. And the warmth. That persistent, impossible warmth in objects that should have been cold. On the 6th day, the search was called off. There was nowhere left to look that hadn't been looked at twice already, and the men were exhausted. May's mother asked Deal to keep searching, but he told her gently that they'd done everything they could. He promised to keep the case open, to follow up on any new information, but he couldn't ask men to keep walking the same ground over and over when there was nothing left to find. That night, Deal went back to the bridge alone. He stood at the center span, where the first Bible had been found, and looked down at the water moving slow and dark below. The fog was rolling in again, thick and damp, and he could barely see the approaches on either side. He thought about May and Thomas, about the way they'd smiled at their wedding, the way May had held the Bible against her chest when her father gave it to her, the way Thomas had stood with his weight on one leg, patient and steady, waiting for his life to start. He thought about the note. "We are still here," not "we are lost," or "we need help." Just, "we are still here," like they were waiting, like they hadn't gone anywhere at all. He heard a sound then, soft, distant, but clear enough to make him turn. It was a 2-note whistle, short and deliberate, coming from the north end of the bridge. He raised his lantern and called out, "Who's there?" No answer. The whistle came again, same 2 notes, and then stopped. He walked toward the sound, boots ringing on the grating, and reached the north approach. No one there. Just fog, and the faint glow of his lantern reflecting off the iron girders. When he turned back toward the center span, he saw something sitting on the crossbeam where he'd been standing a moment before. He walked over slowly, already knowing what it was before he got close enough to see it clearly. Another Bible, same black leather, same red ribbon, still warm. After that week, nobody in Arkansas took that bridge alone before dawn. Not then, not now. The state marshal came through and filed a report, but he didn't have any more answers than Deal did. The case stayed open for 2 years, then quietly closed when no new evidence came to light. The Bibles were returned to May's family, all 4 of them, and her mother kept them in a wooden box in her bedroom until she died. People said she never opened the box again after the day Deal gave them back to her. The ferry dock reopened full-time by the end of September. Pruitt kept the boats running from dawn to dusk, but he wouldn't cross after sunset no matter how much you paid him. The bridge stood empty most nights, and on foggy evenings you could see lanterns hung on both approaches, not to light the way across, but to mark where the safe ground ended and the iron began. The bridge stayed up. The state considered tearing it down that winter, but the cost was too high and the need was still there. Farmers on the west side hauled crops to market on the east, and the lumber mill needed a way to move cut timber without waiting on the ferry, so the bridge stayed and people used it, but only in daylight. By October of 1905, a pattern had formed that would hold for the next 20 years. You crossed before sunset, or you waited for morning. If you were caught on the wrong side of the river when the light started to fail, you took the ferry or you slept in your wagon. You didn't walk that iron span after dark, not alone, not with company, not for any reason that felt worth the risk. Sheriff Deal kept the case file in his desk drawer for the rest of his career. Every few months someone would come forward with a story. They'd seen a couple matching May and Thomas's description in Little Rock, or Memphis, or as far away as St. Louis. And Deal would follow up. but none of it ever led anywhere. The sightings were always vague, secondhand, the kind of thing people convince themselves they saw because the alternative is worse. By 1907, the reports stopped coming. May and Thomas Whitcomb had been gone 2 years, and the only thing anyone knew for certain was that they'd stepped onto the bridge on their wedding night and never stepped off. The families left Arkansas within a year. May's parents sold their land and moved south to stay with relatives near Pine Bluff. Thomas's father quit the mill and took work in another county, and nobody blamed him. Living that close to the bridge, seeing it every day, knowing your son had walked out onto it and vanished, that kind of weight doesn't ease with time. It just settles deeper. The bridge itself changed, not in structure, but in the way people moved around it. Mothers told their children not to play near the approaches, and if a child asked why, the answer was always the same: because I said so. That was enough when they were young. When they got older, someone would tell them the story, usually a grandfather or an uncle, someone who'd been there during the search or knew someone who had, and after that the children didn't need to be told twice. They learned to cross in daylight, learned to keep their eyes on the far side and not look down through the grating at the water below, learned that the bridge was a place you passed through quickly and didn't linger. By 1910, the rules were part of the landscape. Newcomers learned them in their first week. If you took a job at the mill or rented land on the west side, someone would pull you aside and say, "Don't use the bridge after dark. Take the ferry or wait till morning." They wouldn't explain why, and you wouldn't ask because the tone they used made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. It was something people did to stay safe. The way you didn't swim in a flooded river or walk under a tree in a lightning storm. The ferry business picked up. Pruitt hired a second boatman in 1912 and built a covered dock on the west side, so people waiting for the morning crossing wouldn't have to stand in the rain. The state complained that the bridge was being underutilized, but they didn't push it. The local sheriff at the time, a man named Howell who'd taken over after Deal retired, told them plainly that forcing people onto the bridge at night would cause more problems than it solved. The state backed off, and the bridge settled into its new role. A daytime crossing, useful and solid, but not a place you trusted when the light was gone. Strange things kept happening, but not often. Once every year or two, someone would report seeing a light moving across the bridge at night. A single lantern swinging low, traveling from one side to the other at walking pace. If you watched from the bank, the light would reach the center span and stop, hang there for a moment, and then go dark. No one ever went out to investigate. The rule by then was clear. If you see a light on the bridge after sunset, you leave it alone. In 1918, a traveling preacher passing through Arkansas decided the whole thing was superstition. He'd heard the story at a church social and laughed it off, said people were letting fear rule their common sense. He crossed the bridge alone just after dusk on a Sunday evening, carrying a Bible and a lantern, intending to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. He made it to the far side and spent the night at a boarding house in town, and the next morning he told everyone who'd listened that the bridge was perfectly safe. But 3 days later, when he went to leave, he couldn't find his Bible. He'd left it on the table in his room, and when he came back from breakfast, it was gone. The landlady swore no one had been in the room, and the door had been locked. The preacher searched his bags, checked the church where he'd spoken, asked around town. Nothing. A week later, a farmer walking his fence line near the south approach to the bridge found a Bible lying open on a wooden post. Black leather, red ribbon. The inscription inside read, Reverend Paul Astor's, Nashville, Tennessee, 1916. The Bible was still warm. The preacher left Arkansas the next day and never came back. In 1923, the state finally sent an engineer to inspect the bridge. They'd received complaints that it was being neglected, that rust was building up on the grating and the girders needed paint. The engineer spent 2 days examining every joint and rivet, and his report concluded that the bridge was sound. Structurally, there was nothing wrong with it, but in his notes that didn't make it into the official report, he wrote that he'd felt uneasy the entire time he was out there, even in broad daylight. He wrote that the air on the bridge felt heavier than it should, and that twice he'd heard a sound like boots on iron grating when no one else was on the span. He recommended the state consider building a second bridge a mile upriver and decommissioning the old one, but the recommendation was ignored. The bridge stayed. By 1930, the story had become part of the local identity. People in Arkansas didn't talk about it with outsiders, but among themselves it was understood. The bridge was wrong. It had been wrong from the beginning, and putting iron over that stretch of river hadn't fixed whatever made it wrong. It had just made it easier for people to walk into trouble without realizing it. The older generation, the ones who remembered May and Thomas, were dying off. But they'd passed the rules down, and the rules held. The ferry ran morning to evening. The bridge stayed empty at night. And if you were new to the area and asked why, someone would tell you the story, and after that you'd understand. In 1937, a schoolteacher named Helen Marsh moved to Arkansas from Missouri and took a job at the elementary school on the east side of the river. She'd heard the story, but she didn't believe it. She thought it was local folklore, the kind of thing small towns used to make themselves feel special. One evening in late September, she stayed late at the school to finish grading papers, and by the time she looked up it was past sunset. The ferry had stopped running. She could have waited till morning. There was a couch in the teacher's lounge, and she wouldn't have been the first person to sleep at the school. But she was tired, and her apartment was on the west side, just a 10-minute walk past the bridge. She decided to cross. She made it halfway. Then she stopped. Later, when people asked her why, she said she didn't know. She just stopped. She was standing at the center span, looking down through the grating at the water below, and she felt something behind her. Not a sound, not a movement, just a presence, like someone standing close enough to touch her shoulder, but not quite touching. She turned around. No one there, just the empty span stretching back toward the east approach, and the fog starting to roll in. She turned forward again and kept walking, faster now, and she didn't stop until she was off the bridge and standing on solid ground on the west side. When she got to her apartment, she found a Bible sitting on her doorstep. Black leather, red ribbon. She picked it up and opened it, and inside was the inscription, May and Thomas Whitcomb, September 16th, 1905. The Bible was warm. She dropped it, went inside, locked the door, and didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the Bible was gone. Helen Marsh taught in Arkansas for 2 more years, and then she moved back to Missouri. Before she left, she told the principal at the school that the bridge rule wasn't folklore. She said people should listen to it, respect it, and pass it on. The principal, who'd grown up in Arkansas and knew the story by heart, just nodded. By 1945, the bridge was nearly 40 years old, and the state finally built a second crossing 1.5 miles upriver. The new bridge was wider, stronger, better lit, and it had a solid deck instead of grating so you couldn't see the water below. Traffic shifted to the new bridge almost immediately, and the old iron span was used less and less. The ferry service was reduced to twice a day, then once a day, and by 1950 it stopped running altogether. The old bridge sat empty most of the time, used only by locals who needed a shortcut and knew the rules well enough not to break them. The Bibles never stopped appearing. Every few years someone would find one, on a post on a porch laid flat on the steps of the church where May and Thomas were married. Always the same inscription, always warm. People stopped keeping them. They'd leave them where they found them, or they'd take them to the sheriff's office and let someone else deal with it. No one wanted to hold something that shouldn't exist. In 1962, a teenager named Michael Pruitt, grandson of the old ferry operator, decided to spend a night on the bridge as a dare. His friends bet him $20 he wouldn't last till midnight. He took the bet, brought a sleeping bag and a flashlight, and climbed out onto the center span just after sunset. His friends watched from the east approach. By 10 o'clock, Michael was pacing. By 11, he was sitting with his back against a girder, flashlight on, staring at the water below. At 11:47, he stood up, grabbed his sleeping bag, and ran. He didn't stop running until he reached his friends, and when they asked him what happened, he said he'd heard footsteps, 2 sets, walking toward him from both ends of the bridge at the same time. Slow, steady, deliberate. He'd shined his flashlight in both directions and seen no one. But the footsteps kept coming, and when they got close enough that he should have been able to see who was making them, they stopped. Just stopped, and the air on the bridge got warmer, warm enough that he'd unzipped his jacket. That's when he ran. No one ever tried to spend the night on the bridge again. People in Arkansas still cross that old iron span during the day, though most prefer the newer bridge upriver. But no one crosses the old bridge after sunset. Not locals, not strangers who've been warned, not state workers who need to inspect it. The rule has held for more than a century now, passed down from parents to children, from old workers to new hires, from one generation to the next. It's not written on a sign. It's not enforced by law. It's just something people know. The way they know not to touch a hot stove or walk too close to the edge of a cliff. And sometimes on foggy September evenings when the air off the White River sits heavy and cold, people say you can still see a light moving across the old bridge. A single lantern, swinging low, traveling from one side to the other at walking pace. It reaches the center span and stops. And if you're standing close enough, if the wind is still and the night is quiet, you can hear two voices, soft and distant, asking a question no one has ever been able to answer. Are we still here? Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in Arkansas dares to say out loud? What kind of place takes a couple on their wedding night and leaves behind only warmth and Bibles and boot prints that lead nowhere? And why do people in Arkansas still follow rules made 100 years ago by men who saw something on that bridge they could never explain? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.